Hello, everyone. It's another commentary from King's Comments, and today we're going to talk about a lot of different things that are coming to my mind as I've watched some of my favorite YouTube channels on the events specifically in Ukraine and the Putin-Xi meeting that took place and some of the ramifications of the geopolitical New World Order that's taking place at present. Obviously, I've talked about Alexander Mercouris, Alex Christoforou at the Duran. I've talked about Daniel Davis. But I also have to add Reportify Media because I just watched a very, very compelling video where there was a debate going on between Alex from Reportify Media, who's a Canadian, Scott Ritter, a very well-known contributor and military analyst, and someone who is very, very aware of how the world works from a military perspective, being a former Marine Corps officer and nuclear arms inspector back in the day. And he also had a gentleman by the name of Carl Jha on, who also is familiar with how China operates in terms of its geopolitical vision moving forward. I found the entire thing very interesting, and I wanted to draw some conclusions that I think are important in the context of what was being said, and also make some comments about some things that were not said that I believe are significant in the context of where the world is going at present. So let's just talk about real quickly what Scott Ritter was talking about. And I think this is extremely important. I don't think the rest of the world quite understands what Scott was talking about when he mentioned the ramblings of a senator in the United States by the name of Lindsey Graham, who actually proposed the idea of Israel using nuclear weapons and may actually have also proposed the idea of the United States using tactical nuclear weapons against the Russians in Ukraine. I think this is a significant situation that the rest of the world is missing. And what Scott Ritter is basically saying is that there is a thought in the United States establishment within the Uniparty at present where the use of tactical nuclear weapons is acceptable. Should the United States be presented with a loss of hegemony, either through de-dollarization, through encroachment from the Chinese, the Russians, multipolarity, the whole idea of the United States losing its hegemony is a situation that is extremely dangerous for the rest of the world. And I'm going to make this point perfectly clear because I don't think some of his guests actually understand where we are in the context of history. Because sometimes there's a tendency to relate the United States to the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. During those decades, the United States foreign policy was dictated by a certain level of pragmatism that was based off of people who had real diplomacy skills. So we can go back to the days of Henry Kissinger, and following Henry Kissinger, American diplomats were very, very skilled. And they maintained the world order primarily because of the fact that there was no one to challenge them, per se, right after the Cold War. The Russians were never an economic threat, even when they were the Soviet Union. And so the United States never had to fear hegemony threats from the Soviet Union, per se, from an economic perspective. But what we're looking at right now is we're looking at a real threat of American decline from an economic perspective. And we're seeing that play out not only in American cities domestically, but we're seeing it play out in Latin America, Central America, Africa, Asia, wherever the global south is. It's almost like the United States and the West is retreating. We're seeing it in the Sahel in Africa. We're seeing more and more Russian and Chinese interests expanding in areas that were once the realm of the West and the United States. I can remember a time when the United States and its allies were the primary businesses in third world countries, per se, that had a lot of natural resources through the means of public companies. The United States ran a program called OPIC, which is the Overseas Privatization Investment Corporation. And that was primarily an organization that was designed to expand American interests and expand American interests through business relationships. We're not seeing that to the extent that we used to. There's been a full retreat because the United States doesn't have the resources, per se, to put money aside for those kinds of mega projects that the Chinese are doing. And I think what we're seeing right now is we're seeing that the United States is capable of just about anything, as according to what Scott Ritter was saying. And I think that a lot of people who don't take those words seriously better start taking those words seriously. I remember a time when even the threat of someone mentioning nuclear weapons would send chills through the spines of Western capitals, Western presidents in the United States, or even prime ministers anywhere in the world. But today, for whatever reason, a lot of people in the West, including whole populations, are completely oblivious to the fact that we're on the brink of nuclear war, and we're on the brink of a tactical nuclear strike. And I mean that in all sincerity, because I think I learned something in this broadcast today that I didn't learn before. And I'm going to tell you what I learned. And I think Scott Ritter made a huge point. The President of the United States, for example, even though he controls the nuclear football, what has happened over the last decade is that there's been a lot of offloading of the nuclear deterrence directly to commanders in the theater. I think that's very significant because it explains a lot about why the United States wanted to have military-to-military dialogue with the Chinese when the Chinese broke it off. And it seemed like the United States was really pressuring China to do this, because what it basically means is that the military in the United States is the one making the decision at the moment in time when it comes to conflict to that level. So what it tells me is that the president or civilian authority is only involved to the extent that major geopolitical issues are at risk. But should there be a war, or should there be a first strike where a conventional defeat is facing the United States in the form of, as Scott Ritter mentioned, an aircraft carrier being sunk, what is the U.S. response to that? And what he indicated in his diatribe there was that the U.S. response is a tactical nuclear strike on China. Now, I'm going to make a couple of points about Russia and China, and I think this is significant. The Americans fear the Russians to the extent that they fear what the Russians are capable of in a major European conflict. And that fear is manifested in the way that they retreat from positions that they publicly go and mention. So, for example, this word called strategic ambiguity, where you have prime ministers, presidents, or people in power putting out messages or messaging about putting U.S. troops on the battlefield or NATO troops in Ukraine. that kind of strategic ambiguity doesn't work with the Russians, because the Russians simply called in ambassadors from Britain and France and basically told them that should you attempt to do anything that remotely looks like you're fighting on the battlefield of Ukraine, we will nuke the command centers where they originated from, where those troops originated from. Hence, this is one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin basically said that the Russians were putting themselves on nuclear drills for a tactical nuclear capability to launch nuclear weapons. And they did that to show the West that they mean business. And, I think this is extremely interesting because this is something that the world has never seen before. The fact that the entire world isn't up in arms or marching in Western capitals about the saber rattling that's taking place in the West should be alarming to everyone. And I think this is what Scott Ritter is trying to say. It's not alarming enough because the establishment in the United States, the military establishment and the political establishment, is completely detached from reality. And the reason why they're detached from reality is because their hegemony is at risk and they're seeing it play out at risk. So, for example, the West is no longer a place where the Russians fear, because the Russian economy over the last quarter grew by 5.4%, despite all the sanctions the West has put on Russia. Their economy has grown despite Western economies flailing under the huge hit of inflation. And what we're seeing is desperation play out. And so when you start to see desperation play out, accidents can happen, desperate things can take place, and bad things can take place. Another thing that I thought that was interesting was the Putin-Xi meeting in Beijing just recently. This is an extremely important development in world affairs. And the reason why is because all you had to do was to take a look at the tagline of the actual meeting. It's a no-limits partnership. So what does a no-limits partnership actually really mean? Well, in the West, we often use the word alliance, military, economic, you name it. We use the word alliance. Very similar to NORAD, for example, between Canada and the United States. That's a no-limits partnership. What we're seeing right now with Russia and China is the exact same thing that President Nixon and many presidents after him feared. And this is one of the reasons why everyone in the political establishment in the past wanted to make sure that there was never a rapprochement between China and Russia. But now that rapprochement has been sealed. And that no-limits partnership is a partnership that I believe means more than just economic limits. I believe that there is a military aspect to this as well. And this is providing fodder in Western capitals where there is anxiousness, anxiety, and a certain sense of dread and fear. And the reason why this is the case is because you've got the two largest land masses in the world that have joined, for lack of a better word, forces, who see the world in the same way, whose leaders have now become not just great friends, but I see them based off of the hug that Putin got from Xi. And if anyone knows President Xi, they're not huggers per se, but the relationship that those two have is more than just presidential. It's extremely friendly. And the fact that the Russian government or Security Council was in Beijing to meet with its counterpart shows the limits of this no limits partnership, meaning that there's a sharing of information, a sharing of things that never used to take place before. And this would also have to include military. Now, I want to make sure that people understand what Scott Ritter said. And I thought it was very important what he said, and I'm going to echo what he said. The United States of America is by no means a country to be taken lightly. I want to make sure people understand that point. The United States of America is by no means a nation to be taken lightly. Its economic power and its prowess, while on the wane, is still formidable. And what Scott was basically saying is that the United States military doctrine, as it stands today and has been for the last 20 years, is now basically about preemptive nuclear strikes against great powers like Russia and China. And I think this is something that needs to be taken into consideration because what Scott is basically saying is that nuclear war is entirely feasible, entirely plausible, and at this critical juncture in time, an accident can trigger a nuclear conflict. Now, what is the difference between a nuclear war and the use of a strategic nuclear weapon? Well, I often wondered or pondered that case myself, but I believe, as I sit back and think about this, that the use of a strategic nuclear weapon, in my opinion, based off of the events that exist today, is completely plausible, and it's within the realm of feasibility vis-a-vis the actions of the great powers as they sit today. The fact that the West is facing down a major defeat in Ukraine, what other options do they really have? Right? So in Russia, I don't think that the United States is willing to take the risk of facing down the Russians with respect to Ukraine, because Ukraine doesn't present an existential threat to American global hegemony. It may present an existential threat to the Europeans, but it doesn't represent a threat to the United States. And so therefore, I believe most Americans and American leaders are more likely to look at the Russian nuclear arsenal, which is at over 5,500 nuclear warheads, and say to themselves, that's comparable and larger than the U.S. arsenal at present, and so therefore that's not a risk we're willing to take. Now, China is a different story. And China is a different story, and I think what Scott Ritter was trying to make mention of was the fact that the United States doesn't respect China as a military power. They respect China as a global economic power, but not a military one. The Chinese have about 250 nuclear warheads. They could easily, based off of their manufacturing capacity, they could easily outstrip the Russians and the United States with nuclear warheads, but it has never been a priority until I believe now. And I think what we're seeing play out in the South China Sea and what we're seeing play out in Taiwan is saber rattling that allows for a situation for something really bad to happen. And I think the U.S. Foreign policy objective is to go after China, not Russia, because they have failed miserably in trying to deal Putin a significant blow and strip Russia of its resources by regime change. That's not happening. So what are they going to do? And I think Scott Ritter made a very good point about this. I think the Americans are prepared to egg the Chinese on to a conflict where the use of a strategic nuclear weapon against China in the South China Sea or on Chinese ports or on Chinese cities is within the realm of plausibility. And if you look at all of the reports right now that are talking about admirals in the United States talking about a conflict with China, a war with China, that is entirely now the focus of military planning. It's not out there for the sake of being out there. And this is what Scott Ritter is saying, and I think that Mr. Jha was sort of making light of the fact that, the United States is a paper tiger, and they're never going to be able to do, or they're never going to back up the things that they claim that they would do, or that there aren't enough Lindsey Grahams in the world to make that really stick. And I think this is where he is completely mistaken. The American military establishment and the American leadership is delusional. And when I say delusional, I'm talking about they're concerned about their hegemony, not so much in Europe, but they're concerned about their hegemony in Asia. They're concerned about Chinese encroachment in Latin America, Central America, Africa. That encroachment is economic, and economic power is far more useful than military power. Now, when we talk about economic power, what we're actually talking about at the end of the day is the loss of business opportunities for American businesses worldwide at the expense of Chinese companies, Chinese businesses. This is why they were talking about Chinese overcapacity. Okay, because what the Europeans and the Americans are doing is they're initiating a very, very interesting kind of trade war, different from the trade wars that took place under the Trump years. What we're dealing with here is we're dealing with a trade war that could actually lead to a hot war. And when I say it can actually lead to a hot war, all you have to do is look at what's happening with AUKUS, which is an alliance that's similar to NATO that's been formed to counter Chinese aims at controlling the South China Sea. What we're seeing here is we're seeing, American bases in the Asia Pacific region being launching points for American submarines, as Scott Ritter noted, that could provide cover for tactical nuclear weapons to be used in the event of American catastrophic losses on the sea. And while I do believe that the Chinese Navy is not capable of defeating the U.S. Navy in a conventional format, because the United States Navy, as far as I'm concerned, is the greatest Navy in the world, I do believe that they can inflict losses, and those kinds of losses can lead to the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the part of a commander in the theater. Now, I think what's extremely concerning is that both major candidates in the United States, both of them, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, are headed down the wrong direction. So you've got Joe Biden trying to maintain a certain level of status quo and trying to forge alliances with the same old people, and finding out that it's not working and that his friends are now becoming enemies to him. Countries like the GCC countries joining BRICS, de-dollarizing, all these things are starting to happen on his watch. And then you have Donald Trump making comments about sanctioning any country that attempts to de-dollarize, and also talking about the Russian-Chinese rapprochement in terms of a military necessity to deal with it. And the fact that now you have military Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States or military men who are no longer, how do I say this, making military decisions, but just agreeing with the political powers that be. What we're seeing is a shift away from mutual assured destruction, which was basically this whole concept of my deterrent is as big as your deterrent, so therefore we can't commit suicide or homicide on each other. We're seeing a shift away from that to this idea that a tactical nuclear strike can hobble another country, and that a tactical nuclear strike could create winners and losers in terms of the battlefield and in terms of the geopolitical situation. And I think this is extremely dangerous, and it never ceases to amaze me how the mainstream media don't seem to focus on this. We are at a critical point in history, and I see this as being worse than anything we saw during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, I wasn't around during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that event is nothing like what we're seeing today. What we're seeing today is NATO pushing the limits and boundaries of what it should be doing, and taking risks with the Russian leadership in ways that are extremely, extremely bad for their own citizens. I want people to stop and think for a moment that if Vladimir Putin was not in office, and let's just say Medvedev was in office, and if anyone has ever heard Medvedev's words, he's got a very, he's almost, I call him a Nikita Khrushchev sort of approach to foreign policy, a Nikita Khrushchev approach to combat war, diplomacy. He flies off the handle. I think it's extremely important to realize that we're at a situation, critical situation, where events can lead to a nuclear conflict, where people who believe that they can use strategic nuclear weapons, it won't take us to the precipice of a strategic nuclear war. They're completely mistaken. And I think Scott Ritter, in his comments today, really scared Alex from Reportify Media. And Mr. Jha, Carl Jha, I mean, I don't quite know what he is smoking or thinking, because he has no idea what the American establishment is thinking at present. And I think there's context for the situation, because the United States is the only country to have used nuclear weapons in war against the nation of Japan. And while in the West it's considered an oh well moment, around the world most people view that as a situation where they're more than likely capable of doing it again. So, if the United States believes that its global hegemony is at risk, where they're no longer the preeminent power, it's quite likely that we could be sliding down a slippery slope. And I think this is important for people to understand in the context of American leadership, not Chinese leadership, not Russian leadership. Because what we have in China and Russia at present is we have sober minds who are making sober decisions. But they clearly have made a decision to join forces, because China by itself cannot defeat the United States, but Russia and China can. And what I mean by defeat, what is defeat? Well, defeat, at the end of the day, for the American mind, is the end of the unipolarity or a unipolar world, and that's defeat for them. A multipolar world is not the order that they want to see, because a multipolar world leads to the collapse of the dollar internationally. It leads to an issue with trade settlement. It leads to internal domestic demise, because the Federal Reserve can't print more dollars because there's not enough trade settlement dollars to back what's already being printed. So it creates a real situation of supply and demand issues internally. And I think defeat for the United States has changed. We used to think of defeat for the United States as an external power coming to the U.S. shores and defeating the American people in a combat situation like a normal conventional war. That's not the case anymore. Defeat for the U.S. is not that. Defeat is the end of hegemony. Now, the question is, and this is the big question, is the American leadership adult enough to be able to see that defeat as an opportunity, or do they see that defeat or change in the world, which should not be seen as a defeat, but do they see that as a direct conflict or a direct violation of their national security interests? And as I look on the horizon, I have to be honest, I don't see the current American leadership in the House, the Senate, with exception to a few people, that are willing to see the trees between the hedgerows or the hedgerows between the trees. There's a lack of understanding of what's going on internationally with the American public. And this is a serious, serious matter, because what happens internationally affects what happens domestically in the U.S., and it also affects the free world. It affects Canada, Great Britain, all of the countries that align with the West. And this is a serious, serious matter. So as we look at the current situation with Russia and China becoming one country, two leaders, one country with a great land army and a great air force, and another with a burgeoning great naval capability and great naval possibilities, what we're looking at here is we're looking at a situation where none of those countries will be affected by American sanctions to the extent that the Americans would have liked or wished if they were doing it to one country alone. So if you look at why Russian economic growth is at 5.4%, and considering what's happened with Western sanctions, the reason for that is because they have doubled and tripled their trade with China and other countries like India, but specifically China. When you look at what Russia really is, I mean, Borrell, the EU chief, is a bit of an idiot, because they're more than just a gas pump. Russia supplies uranium. They're rich in just about every single natural resource in the world. And their capabilities are limitless in that regard. The Chinese marketplace is also limitless. So they're going to be building pipelines through Mongolia. They're going to be doing trillions of dollars worth of trade in their national currencies that don't get settled in dollars. I mean, this is huge. And if the United States wants to sanction China, then they're playing a very, very dangerous game, because somebody's got to pick up the debt or the treasury from the treasuries that the Chinese are beginning to dump at present. I mean, last quarter, I believe, the Chinese dumped $53.3 billion worth of U.S. treasuries, bringing their total down significantly from 1.1 trillion in treasuries down to somewhere around 600 billion in treasuries. So this is huge. I mean, you're going to start to see the Chinese move away from dollar and treasuries and diversify more into commodities and gold. And you're going to start to see BRICS grow. You're going to start to see more countries de-dollarize. And you're going to see more geopolitical tug of war over hot areas like the Philippines, like Taiwan, like Ukraine. And I don't see how the West wins in any of these areas outside of promulgating a war. And as I've mentioned earlier, the United States thought that they could kick the door down with Russia and the whole rotten thing would fall down. And what they found is that the Russian military-industrial complex is every bit as strong as their own. And Putin has become stronger. Russia has become stronger. And as Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, mentioned, if the West wants to try diplomacy out on the battlefield, then they're more than willing to go that route. And clearly, as it looks right now, if this goes on for another year or 2 years, there will be no one left in Ukraine to fight. So this is a scary situation for Western hegemony. Does the West pivot back from the brink of nuclear war? I mean, that is the big question. And I think Scott Ritter is 100% correct in stoking the fire about this and raising the alarm, because it's an alarm that people are not listening to. And I think part of the reason why they're not listening to it is that their heirs are not aware of how the U.S. Government works and who's in charge of the government today, and the kinds of conversations that are being had out in the public without someone shouting others down saying you're a lunatic and it's radical. I mean, what Lindsey Graham said about Israel using nuclear weapons and making the comment that it's okay for them to use it in the context of how the U.S. used it against Japan is sheer nonsense and lunacy on a level that I cannot begin to tell you. And the fact that no one shouted him down and sees him as a radical lunatic is scary, because it means that his thought process is now a huge part of the establishment, to the point where planning for the use of strategic nuclear weapons is completely within the realm of plausibility. In fact, I'm going to make this comment right now. The United States is already planning for the use of strategic nuclear weapons use, because clearly, why would they have wanted the Chinese military to open up a dialogue with the U.S. military to avoid what they believed were situations where conflict can get out of hand? So, I mean, stop and think about that for a moment. The U.S. military wants to have an open dialogue with other militaries because commanders in the theater of operations that they're in can now make decisions to actually launch a nuclear strike or a strategic strike based off a set of conditions that have to be met. Now, the Chinese may not be aware of this fact to the extent that they should, but they are next. The Americans have failed with the Russians. They know the Russians mean business because the Russians are prepared to attack and nuke Western decision-making centers. And if anyone doubts that, trust me, the West doesn't doubt it, because they stopped making those comments as soon as their ambassadors got hauled in. So the Chinese have to be aware that this situation is now at their doorstep, and Scott Ritter's 100% right. So on that note, I want to thank everyone for listening to my commentary. I do want to draw a special attention to Reportify Media, Alex, and his wonderful broadcast at Reportify Media, Danny Haifong and his broadcast, Scott Ritter, who's on as a contributor on many shows, channels, as well as Carl Jha. And again, I think that people have to watch these YouTube channels, Daniel Davis included, because they're sounding the alarm, not just on the military situation in Ukraine and the geopolitical situation in the world today, but they're sounding the alarm in general and where we're headed, because this is not good. This is not good at all. We're talking about a world on the brink, on the precipice of nuclear war. And I think people have to sit back and punch somebody in the face and start developing sanity and reason with the people that they elect. Okay? I mean, if anyone thinks that Donald Trump is going to be able to talk down to the Chinese or force the Russians to accept a peace agreement that they don't want to take, or that aren't within their national security interests, good luck. If you think you're going to be able to sanction countries, the United States will be finished from an economic perspective if they take that route. So people have to wake up. Wake up. And Scott Ritter's 100% right. Thanks, everyone. I want everyone in my last conclusive comments to watch their broadcasts, because their broadcasts are extremely compelling. They've got a lot of subscribers, all of them on their broadcasts, a lot of views. My channel is new, but I felt, as someone who has listened to their channels, that I felt I needed to say something, because I'm seeing a world erode right in front of me in a way that I can't have even imagined. And I don't even think Scott Ritter could have even imagined as it sits today. So with that, we will close this commentary and look forward to the next one coming soon.